quality is your product's most important feature. And if you don't ship quality first, everything else that you deliver is going to get undermined.
Strategy matters. It's one of the two sides of the coin, strategy and execution. And most of your strategies aren't good enough.
When people talk about product strategy, they tend to conflate lots of different things together: priorities, goals, roadmap, mission, vision. The company mission and the company strategy work together to really define the context that is defining the work of the product team. The roadmap is really about defining at a very high level what are the things, the big initiatives from a product standpoint that the product team is committing to deliver. The problem with strategy is it's so big and ambitious that it can get ambiguous, because sometimes taking 2 weeks and zooming out can help you move much faster over the next 12 months than just being heads down. Strategy gets implemented through the micro decisions of individual people. Good leaders care about the details, right? We talked about dynamic range. They don't just focus on what's high level, they focus all the way down to the nitty-gritty execution.
The pixels matter, the execution matters, the quality matters. If there's anything we've learned from Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Ravi Mehta, it's that you have to get into the details.
We've all seen products that are the result of A/B testing. They become a Frankenstein. Individuals are spiky, but teams are well-rounded. Frameworks are a tool, not a rule. If you're caring about someone personally, but you're not challenging them, that's ruinous empathy. Scalable leadership is when you deliver on both at the same time. You as a leader feel like you have a sense of control, and the team has a sense of autonomy. And if you can do that, that's the perfect place to be.
All right, everyone. I'm super excited about today's episode with Ravi Mehta. Ravi, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited about it as well.
So for most of you, Ravi really needs no introduction. He was Chief Product Officer at Tinder, Director of Product at Facebook, VP of Product at TripAdvisor. More recently, he's been an EIR at Reforge, founder of Outpace, an angel investor. I'm excited about today's episode because, number one, Ravi has developed several frameworks that provide really good shortcuts for good thinking in product management. Number two, I've listened to some of his prior podcast experiences 2 and 3 times over, and each time I get more insights because he distills his years of experience really concisely. And number 3, his approach to product strategy is both conceptual but also really tactical, which is what you come to this newsletter and podcast for. So let's dive in. Mastering the art of product strategy from frameworks to execution. We recently had Satyajit Salgar from Google on this podcast talking a little bit about product strategy. And he said product strategy is the number one core job of PMs. I do tend to agree, but I can also see the flip side, right? Maybe execution matters in certain environments, or the strategy execution gap tends to be where most teams fail. So maybe that's actually more important. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I tend to think like product strategy is really, really important, but it can quickly get undermined by execution. So if you have the very best product strategy in the world, if the product isn't executed well, if it's not working well for customers, none of that product strategy is going to matter. And so the analogy I like to use is imagine staying at a 5-star resort, a Four Seasons or a Ritz or something like that. They spent a massive amount to give you this really luxurious experience. And if you have a cold shower in the morning, none of that matters, right? You know, if they don't have any hot water when you go to get ready in the morning, and it'll completely ruin your day. And so that's a case of execution really undermining the importance of strategy. And I think too often PMs, you know, as they become more and more senior, tend to focus on how can I be more strategic? I've spent a lot of time in the trenches. I've spent a lot of time on execution, and now I want to think about the big questions.
This episode is brought to you by Addio, the next generation CRM. Imagine a world where your CRM is powerful, easily configured, and actually intuitive. Addio makes that a reality. As I've profiled in the Product Growth newsletter, setting up Addio takes less than a minute, and within seconds of syncing your email and calendar, you'll see your relationships in one place, enriched with valuable data, including things like relationship strength. Addio lets you build Zapier-style automations, create powerful reports, and works for any go-to-market motion, from PLG to sales-led. ADIO is designed for the next era of companies like yours. And companies like yours shouldn't have to deal with inflexible, one-size-fits-all CRMs. Join industry leaders like 11 Labs, Replicate, and Modal. Head to adio.com/product growth and you'll get 15% off your first year. That's ATTIO.com/product growth. I'm excited to chat with Andrew Liu, the founder of OneSchema. Hey, Andrew.
Yes, thank you for having me on, Akash.
So OneSchema recently made an appearance in the newsletter. At that time, I got to know that you work with some pretty amazing customers like Ramp, Vanta, Scale, and Watershed. What's the latest with OneSchema? What are you really proud of having shipped recently?
Yeah, so we just launched OneSchema File Feeds, which allows you to build an integration with any system in 15 minutes, just by recording yourself cleaning a spreadsheet file. We see our customers all the time getting stuck with hacks and workarounds, and the product teams that we work with don't have to turn down prospects because their systems are too hard to integrate with. We enable our customers to offer thousands of integrations without involving their engineering team at all.
That sounds great. What's the meme? The world is built on spreadsheets? I feel like these integrations as a PM would allow me to know that I could buy a solution that can handle the edge cases, that can handle all of the weirdness in the data instead of having yet another feature to maintain.
Absolutely, Akash. I mean, we've heard so many horror stories of multi-day outages from even just a handful of bad records. We're laser focused on integration reliability to help teams end all of those distractions that come up with integrations. We have a built-in validation layer, and it stops any bad data from entering your system, and OneSchema will notify your team immediately if any data looks incorrect.
So as all you listening know, importing incorrect data can cause headaches for you and your customers. If you want to solve that problem, think of OneSchema, and you can find them at oneschema.co.
And that's really important, but it doesn't take away from the need to focus on execution. At the end of the day, I worked with a Spotify product leader, and he had this great saying, which is, quality is your product's most important feature. And if you don't ship quality first, everything else that you deliver is going to get undermined. And I think you can sort of see that in the success of Spotify versus Tidal. Like Tidal had every reason to win in the streaming wars. It had these, relationships with really stellar artists, some exclusive content on the platform, a focus on quality. But the core moment-to-moment listening experience on Spotify was so spotless. You could, listen to an entire song without it skipping. Songs would start immediately after you hit the play button. And that's a great case where, at the end of the day, the product strategy didn't matter because the execution on the product was a lot better. And so I really encourage product leaders as they get more senior to not think about becoming more high level, but really think about having a larger dynamic range. The individual decisions, what a button says, what a UI looks like, it all still matters because at the end of the day, our customers looking at pixels or engaging with something on a very moment-to-moment basis, and that can either enhance the strategy and fuel the strategy, or it can undermine it.
I like that, having a larger dynamic range. I think that really relates back to some of the, hot takes that we've been hearing about in product management recently. For instance, Nikita Bayer on Lenny's podcast, he said, product managers in big tech, they aren't doing much product management because they're not getting into the pixels. They're not getting into the design. It sounds like this concept of dynamic range, it includes everything from strategy, the 30,000-foot view, to the actual pixels in the design, like the 0-foot on the ground range. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is really important. Customer expectations are really high, so they want a really high quality product. There's so much competition in the space today that if you don't have a really high quality product, there's someone else who will deliver something really high quality. And so one example that I think is interesting is looking at like the home security space. That's a great example of a space where you had entrenched competitors like ADT who just thought there was no way that anyone else could compete with them. They had this installed base of homes that had their hardware, that were using them, that were paying monthly fees. And so from a strategy standpoint, they were doing pretty well. But from a moment-to-moment consumer standpoint, their products just weren't as good as they could be given where technology had gotten to. And Ring and SimpliSafe came in, rethought the product experience, and was very quickly able to disrupt what was considered to be a pretty entrenched market. And that came down to individual decisions around, how well does the app work? How easy is it to set up? Can I control it from my phone? Can I arm it or disarm it from my phone? All things that, the bigger players weren't thinking as much about. And so as a product leader, if you're not thinking about, the few moments a day that your customer is using your product and really putting yourselves into their shoes, none of the strategy stuff, even if you have a very entrenched positional advantage, is really going to matter over the long term, given all of the competition in all of these areas.
So there are really two sides of the same coin, strategy and execution. You can't succeed without either. Interestingly, though, I tend to be of the point of view, and I think Satyajit shared the same, that most product strategy documents that you actually see and most product strategies that we encounter as product leaders in the wild as we join a new company or new job, they aren't so good. And why is that? Like, do you agree, first of all? And if so, like, what do you think are some of the drivers of why so many product strategy documents that we're seeing these days developed by well-intentioned PMs aren't so effective?
I think there's a handful of things that mean that when product managers go in and create strategy, is not as good as it could be. The first one is companies very rarely give the time that it takes to, one, develop a really good strategy and then implement a really good strategy. One of the things that Brian Balfour from Reforge talks a lot about is strategic sequencing. And if you look at really successful companies, you can look at over time how they sequenced a series of strategic moves to be able to accomplish something that was really impressive over the long term. But had they not had the patience and the foresight to do that, they wouldn't have been able to implement that strategy. And so I think too often companies are like, what are we going to get done in this quarter? And what are we going to see in terms of the revenue results? And so that lack of buffer really prevents individuals, PMs, and product leaders from thinking about strategy on a long enough time horizon. And so I think that's the first problem. I think the second problem is that because there's this time pressure, what tends to happen strategically is people are looking for shortcuts. And what's the best strategic shortcut? The best strategic shortcut is to copy what someone else is doing and say, well, this is working for this other company. Let's go ahead and do this. And so when a company says, oh, okay, their strategy is our strategy, by default, what it means is that you've ignored all of your unique positional advantage. And as a result, their strategy is not going to work as well for you as it did for them. And so the combination of those two things, I think being impatient for results and then thinking about, what are the shortcuts, copying competitors and cloning rather than thinking deeply and in a really radically candid way about what your positional advantages are, mean that strategy that comes out of the pipeline is not nearly as good as what it could have been. And I don't think it's down to individual skills, because a lot of times I'll talk to PMs and product leaders and they know the answer. They can articulate what the great strategy is, and they know all of the things that need to go into that. But the hard thing is, well, how do we convince our leaders to really adopt that and want to give us the time and the resources and take the risk to do that? Because part of good strategic thinking is based on intuition. That means you have to have a gut feeling. You can't always prove out a really strong strategy versus you can, look at a competitor that's doing something really well and say, let's go in that direction. If it works for them, it might work for us.
Yeah, I tend to find that time pressure is really common. People might even feel a pressure to release a strategy like 30 days into a new job. It's probably just way too soon for you to actually develop that type of strategic insight. And in our pre-podcast prep, you mentioned that you're now advising a couple companies, working with almost 6 companies. So you get to see a lot of different companies. It's a unique perspective that a lot of practicing product leaders, they might not be able to get to look into as many cultures at once. So I'm curious, like, if you had to put some basic numbers around it for us to get a lay in the landscape, like how many product teams are developing really good product strategies and putting it into documentation and getting that leadership buy-in? How many are just doing okay? And then how many truly have a problem and need to fix this?
Rough edges in terms of strategic thinking. And so the companies that are doing really well have a lot more leeway to not really nail the strategy. And the companies that are not doing as well have a very limited runway. And so, they need to make decisions really quickly. And that sort of exacerbates those two problems that we thought about. If a company has limited runway, they need to get to results fast, and they tend to do it by taking a shortcut of just looking at what's working for other people. So I think the majority of teams are actually in this situation where the strategy is not as tight as it could be. And you can see in a lot of companies that have been really successful over a long period of time that they create for themselves margin or buffer to be able to create the strategy that is going to work really well for them and then sequence that out over time. And I think that that's really like a top 10% of companies, top 15% of companies are able to do that consistently and over a long period of time and really stay true to that strategic thinking.
I agree. It's probably like 10 to 15%. And even within those companies, I feel like there's a fairly big range of product teams. Probably like maybe 30 to 40% of the product teams themselves have a good strategy, but I feel like the majority, they're still struggling. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true.
So I hope we've emphasized to everybody then that strategy matters. It's one of the two sides of the coin, strategy and execution. And most of your strategies aren't good enough. So that's where I want to put the meat of today's episode is get your hard-won advice on how folks can develop that better strategy and really level up their strategy. And you've talked about it in a couple podcasts. You also developed the Reforge product strategy and product leadership program.
Just credit where credit's due. I just wanted to say the product strategy program was Fareed and Casey Winters. They had originally developed it, but I came in and I taught the first cohort. And highly recommend the program. And then I also did create the product strategy stack, which is something that we talked about a couple of years ago on Reforge and is a framework that a lot of people come back to.
Makes sense. So tell us more about that product strategy stack. I think it's a bit controversial in some elements, especially the ordering. So can you walk us through that?
So the idea with the product strategy stack came out of this notion that when people talk about product strategy, they tend to conflate lots of different things together: priorities, goals, roadmap, mission, vision. And so everyone means something a little bit different when they talk about strategy. And that makes it much harder to define and develop a strategy that really works for the company. And so what the product strategy stack does is it attempts to pull apart those different terms into a set of concrete concepts that a team can use to develop their strategy top down and then to really understand if their strategy is working bottoms up. And so there's 5 elements of the strategy stack. The top level is the company mission. What does the company want to accomplish in the world? The next level is the company strategy, which is what is the rigorously logical plan for the company to be able to achieve its mission. If you have a mission, you need a strategy to achieve that mission. The company mission and the company strategy work together to really define the context that is defining the work of the product team. Because ultimately, the goal of the product team is to have product to be a lever for the company strategy to help the company be successful. And product is just one piece of that success. And so the company mission and the company strategy set the overall company objectives that the product team can then use to figure out what is the right product strategy. And so the next level is the product strategy. And then the final 2 layers are product roadmap and product goals. And so product strategy sits in the middle between the company objectives and the day-to-day work of the product team. So whereas the company strategy is what is the rigorously logical plan that we're going to use to achieve our company mission, the product strategy is what is the product's role in that overall company strategy? What is the glue that connects what we're doing on the product team with what we need to achieve as a company? And then once you have a clear product strategy, you can define 2 things. One is your product roadmap, which is what are you going to build and why and in what order. That's where that strategic sequencing piece comes in and is really important. And then the next piece is what are the product goals? How do you actually measure whether or not you're making progress on your roadmap and you're making progress on your strategy? And so collectively, those 5 steps, the company mission, the company strategy, the product roadmap, and the product goals give you a framework with which you can use to working from the top down, define a really tight, coherent product strategy. And then if you are trying to understand, is our product strategy working, you can work your way bottoms up through the stack to really understand that. Are you hitting your goals? If not, then your roadmap might be wrong. And if your roadmap isn't working, maybe your product strategy is off, or maybe the company strategy or the company mission isn't providing enough context. So that's how people can use that kind of stack of ideas to both define and debug their product strategy.
I love how the product strategy stack for me is connecting company strategy ultimately to a roadmap of what people are building. And as we talked about at the beginning, that strategy execution gap, that's often the case where you just get this hodgepodge of features. It might be what the VP of sales wanted, what the CTO wanted, and then there's just a few product things left in there. But here we're trying to connect the two. And I think it's solving one of those key problems. So that is one reason I love the ordering. Now, one thing that I tend to get hung up on, and I think other people who have talked to you about this have also mentioned this, I'm curious what the overall reaction has been, is having goals come after roadmap. Because I think what the case people make for why having goals after roadmap can be bad is because it tends to lead to less empowerment of the product teams, because they, instead of owning, like, let's say a metric, and if we believe that outcomes matter more than outputs, they start to own these roadmap feature items, or they start to make commitments to those roadmap feature items. And that sometimes inhibits their ability to have said something in a product review, discover something, quickly change it, and then ship that versus what they had said in the product review to executives. So I'm curious, like, how you deal with that tension. I'm sure a lot of people have brought it up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things. So definitely controversial in just my opinion. So people can, approach the stuff in any way that makes sense. One thing that kind of guides the overall thinking here is that goals is actually the output of strategy, not the input to strategy. I think a lot of times companies can sort of get themselves in a tricky place where they say, our strategy is to increase revenue by 10%. And actually that's not your strategy. That's a goal. And, you could achieve it in certain ways. You cannot achieve it in other ways. The only way that you're going to really, have a high probability of achieving it is if you understand what your positional advantages are and how you're going to execute on that strategy really well. So the product strategy stack is one where the mission is the thing that starts at top, and then the goals come out of the bottom. Specifically to the question of, does the roadmap come first or do the goals come first? I like to use the analogy of a road trip. If, I'm going from LA to Palm Springs, it's about 100 miles. It's about a 2-hour journey. And I'll know that I've gotten there after driving for 2 hours. But if I don't have a clear roadmap, if I don't know that I'm going to Palm Springs, then that goal of driving for about 2 hours is actually meaningless. And I think that that's what happens with a lot of product teams, is they set a goal absent the context, and whether or not they hit or don't hit that goal, it's sort of absent of meaning. If you hit the goal, what does that mean? How is that providing evidence that you've made progress on your strategy? So the goal of driving 2 hours makes sense if I know I'm going to Palm Springs. But if I just decide I want to drive 2 hours from LA, there's lots of different places that I can go. There's lots of different destinations. And who knows if I'm going to reach the right one. And so the product roadmap provides a framework with which to understand what is the core set of things that we're doing from a product standpoint, and how do we want to sequence them over time. And the product goals help us understand if our roadmap isn't working. And I think one of the missing pieces here that has caused a lot of confusion or consternation is there's still a set of things that the product team creates relative to the goals. They create a set of feature strategy, they create a backlog, there's a bunch of things that they build. So the goal is not for the product roadmap to be so fine-grained and so specific that it gives the product team no ability to maneuver. The product roadmap should be at a level that's high enough that it provides some guardrails, so it provides an overall direction and makes sure that the team is aligned. And then, there's lots of different ways, once you know what the roadmap is, to figure out what is the right way to build towards that and to understand whether or not from a goal perspective you're making progress.
Got it. Okay, so it sounds like it's not necessarily that the roadmap is committing to specific features or meant to constrain the product team in any way. This is like a slightly broader definition of a roadmap, maybe a roadmap that's more focused on some of the problems you want to solve or some of the high-level direction your feature might be going, but it's not like a commitment to anybody that this is what we're going to build.
No, it's really a destination, and then your goals are relative to that destination. So in the road trip example, if we know we're going to Palm Springs, we can take lots of different routes. You can decide if you want to stop along the way. You can decide if you want to detour. There's many different ways to get there. And so the roadmap is really about defining at a very high level, what are the things, the big initiatives from a product standpoint that the product team is committing to deliver, rather than being really specific about what is the team doing day to day.
Makes sense.
So roadmap, I think, is often on the level of months or quarters rather than days and weeks.
Makes sense. So it's maybe not what people traditionally visualize as like a Gantt chart of these are the features we're going to deliver. It's much more of a conceptual problems to solve, direction we're going type of roadmap, in which case I'm completely aligned with that ordering as well. The next question I have is, who should be defining what level of the stack? So if you take like a traditional Marty Kagan approach, the product strategy, that is the job of product leaders. So people with titles kind of like group product manager through to CPO. And the roadmap that often comes down to like the actual PMs on the team as being owners. And I'm not sure who would own the goals in this case, maybe like a data analyst or the PM. Is that how you intend it to be used as well, or how you see it and recommend it?
I think it really depends on the situation. So part of what I've tried to do with the frameworks that I've shared is to share things that are really practical. And I think practically different organizations approach strategy in different ways. Some organizations will have very product-oriented CEOs. They'll be small enough that the CEO will kind of have a feeling for what they want all the way from the top of the stack to the specific roadmap and goals. And so oftentimes those CEOs are defining a lot of that. The head of product might define a lot of that. In a bigger organization, there's more room to say that there's different levels in the organization that should be defining at different levels of that stack. And so one of the things I encourage product leaders to do is to figure out your comfort level in terms of what to enable your team to contribute to. And certain product leaders will have these incredibly high-performing teams, and they'll be like, I don't need to worry about the product strategy and the roadmap. I've got people on my team. I know that they're going to be able to execute really well on that. I just need to make sure that they have a company-level understanding of what our mission is, what our strategy is, what are some of the things that we're trying to solve for. Other product leaders may say, I'm looking at my team. I just don't have a senior enough team, or I'm just not seeing the ability for the team to be able to operate at that more strategic level, and I need to get a lot more detailed. The goal ultimately is to enable your team so that they can define the goals, define the roadmap, and define the product strategy. But the stack gives a framework for which to be able to think about, do you have a team where they have that level of capability and where you can give them that level of trust and autonomy, or do you need to provide more specific, more granular guardrails, and then kind of show by example what a really good product strategy looks like, and then help them level up over time so that then the product leader can zoom out. And that goes to that point we talked about earlier around dynamic range. Part of dynamic range is being able to kind of zoom into the details and zoom out. And a key part of that is being able to figure out how to do that well with your team. What's the right level to zoom into to give them the right level of support? And for some teams, that'll be at a very zoomed in level of view, and you'll need to provide really detailed support. And for other teams, you can zoom out a little bit more and provide them with more autonomy.
Makes sense. So now I want to peel back one more layer of the onion, specifically on the product strategy layer of that stack. Can you walk us through, what are the key components, or maybe an example, since they tend to vary so much, of a really great strategy document, product strategy document?
Yeah, definitely. So I've shared one on the Reforge Artifacts site. It's TripAdvisor Travel Hub. So a few years ago, this was actually a while ago now, we had to answer the question of how do we deliver a much better travel planning experience on TripAdvisor so that people can come to the site and rather than kind of come sort of intermediated through Google each time, they can come to the site, set up a trip and then start to save things to that trip. The goal being to engage them more deeply in the trip planning process so that they do more of that trip planning through TripAdvisor directly rather than intermediated through Google. And as part of doing that, we had a really hard set of strategic things that we needed to solve for. The TripAdvisor product at the time was heavily optimized through A/B testing. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future or later on in the conversation. And moving like key parts of the product around had the risk of potentially cannibalizing key parts of the site and of the business. And so we knew we needed to develop a strategy that was really clear, that was able for everyone to understand, where we could measure whether or not that strategy was successful. And so we put together a format for the strategy document, which I still use to this day. I've done it multiple times. I've used it at Tinder. I've used it with startups that I've been advising. And the central part of that strategy document is 15 to 20 wireframes that answer the question of what will the product look like if we execute really well on this strategy. And the reason to use wireframes and not just to describe things is that product in most cases is a very visual medium. We're ultimately putting an interface in front of a user, and individual decisions, individual design decisions, for example, can be product strategy decisions. So just deciding which of the 5 icons go on the bottom of your mobile app is a strategy decision. You're deciding what are the 5 most important elements of our business that we want to surface to users. And if you just describe that in text and you don't show it visually, it's really hard for anyone to have sort of a coherent understanding of the strategy. Everyone sees the strategy document and walks away with a different perspective on things. And the analogy I like to use here is it's a little bit like if you're building or renovating a house. If you were to go to an architect and they gave you a Word doc instead of a blueprint, there's no way you would, hand over your money to have them execute on that renovation, because you wouldn't have a clear enough understanding of what is actually going to get built. You need a blueprint. You need to be able to see it visually in order to have confidence in what the output is going to be. That same thing that applies to architecture also applies to products. And so it's really important, I think, to have a visual component to strategy documents.
And that's probably one of your hottest takes, because I know personally, having posted about PMs writing wireframes or developing wireframes and PRDs or strategy documents in the past, that those are always kind of the most vociferously argued against posts that I make. I once had one post on LinkedIn go totally viral in the design community with basically designers from Netflix, Meta, Google, just everybody getting mad at the idea of PMs even building a single wireframe. And a lot of it, I had to just beat back by saying, well, I really mean product sketches. But I'm curious, like, on this hot topic here of who should be building these wireframes in the product strategy document, what is your take?
So I think if you look at the core triad in product development, design, engineering, and product management, there is lots of blur between the two roles at a certain level, right? So there's certain things that designers are going to always do. There's certain things that engineers are always going to do. And then there is crossover. And depending on the company that you're building, depending on the team that you have around you, different people can play a different role. So, for example, when we built out this product strategy document for the TripAdvisor Travel Hub, the lead designer was the one who did all of those wireframes. That didn't mean that because the lead designer did it, those wireframes shouldn't be in the strategy document. Those were absolutely critical for us to understand at a very concrete level what was getting built. And so the document is not prescriptive about who should do what, just about what it takes to actually deliver a document that is going to be something that everyone can understand and is going to adequately describe the strategy. And so if you're at a company where you're really early on, you might not have a designer to work with, or the designers are working on other things, and you need to create a really concrete strategy, then maybe the PM should open up Balsamiq or Figma or whatever and put together some sketches of what the product looks like. If you can work really closely with your design counterpart to do that, that's great as well. The really important thing, though, is that doesn't slip through the cracks. Because I think historically with strategy, there's this handoff between oh, product put together a strategy doc, and now we're going to do the designs on it. And now we're going to do the technical feasibility on it. And there's things that get lost in translation through that assembly line. And the people who looked at that initial strategy doc, if we're being honest, they have wildly different visions of what the end product is going to look like. So rather than think about this serially as an assembly line, take the most critical part and put it into the document up front. And I go back to that blueprint analogy. You would never do a renovation on your home or build a home without seeing blueprints for what you're building. You can't ask executives within a product organization to buy into something that they can't see.
Yeah, I find that the wireframe is easily sort of the best canvas for feedback. I think just Steel Manning, sort of the other side here, who's still kind of upset that we're putting wireframes in our strategy document. It goes back to that empowerment thing we were talking about earlier with roadmaps and goals, which is it tends to anchor people. Like we talked about the CEOs who tend to have like the full product strategy stack vision already in mind. As soon as you put a wireframe in front of them, they tend to start to look at that and they tend to start to say, okay, you need to do this, this, and this. And then if they come back 3 months later and what's in the app looks totally different, they're like, I already told you this. You guys are dumb. You guys don't get it. So how do you kind of solve those problems while still providing a great canvas for feedback by having wireframes in the product strategy?
Yeah, I mean, one way I would look at it is that might happen if the executive looked at wireframes, but that will definitely happen if they just looked at a strategy document that just had words, right? Everyone's got a different vision. The more you can sort of start to shape that vision and provide a concrete understanding of what it is, the easier it is for people to understand the trade-offs. And one of the ways that this is really important is the specific copy that you're using, the specific layout of the user experience, how you're using limited real estate. Because the problem with strategy is it's so big and ambitious that it can get ambiguous. And if it gets ambiguous, everyone is going to see what they want in the strategy rather than really understand what are the trade-offs that need to happen. So, a company might say, here's these 15 tenets that are really important for our product, and we want to make sure that all of our customers understand all of these benefits of our product before they buy. And yet, on the homepage, you've only got room for like 15 or 20 words. You maybe even less on mobile. And unless you're clear up front at the strategy phase about what are those trade-offs, you're going to make those trade-offs anyway, and you're going to do it likely in a way that's less strategic, where it's just your last minute, people are working late, they're just trying to get it done, and so they're just trying to figure out what copy works. And then you get a product that doesn't have those trade-offs made strategically. They get made from an execution point of view and without full context in terms of what you're trying to achieve. And so I think this, although it's a very different way of approaching strategy, it's a really good tool for communication. It's a really good way to trade off. It's a really good way to build understanding. You're never going to eliminate all of the miscommunication, but you go a much longer step towards making sure that the micro decisions that need to get made in service of that strategy are being done in a way that's aligned with the strategic context that you're operating within.
Got it. Yeah, it's kind of like, what is the alternative? What is the alternative going to result in? Is it going to be better? Oftentimes we know that either way, whether it's a written or a wireframe, we're going to face some of these problems. So the part where I think people still struggle is, how do we make sure that the team can react to new evidence in discovery? What is the right way to handle, for instance, we presented this at product review, we got the entire company's buy-in on some wireframes, but we put it through usability testing and nobody likes this design, so we've taken a big departure. How do we kind of like communicate that out proactively to address that concern?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just a matter of updating the strategy document to say, here's what we've learned. We made a bunch of assumptions based on what we knew at the time. We have more information now. And so we're going to be approaching this a little bit differently. As a result, we've created a new version of the strategy document. We also might have these companion things to go with it, whether it's user research or whether it's more detailed designs for that particular area of the product. And so I think one of the things that's true as PMs get more and more senior is the amount of time that product leaders need to spend communicating upward and outward just goes up as a ratio of all of their time. And one of the reasons for that is because of this thing around strategy, where strategy communication has a half-life, and it has a pretty short half-life. It has a half-life because people forget it. It has a half-life because things change. And so continuing to sort of get the strategy out there, to re-communicate it, is important to make sure that everyone is as aligned as possible. You'll never get everyone fully aligned, but just by coming back to it frequently, you can help with that alignment. And then because you've made visuals a really key part of the strategic communication, you can actually show the before and after in a very concrete way, versus you might learn things down the road from a user research standpoint and change some things strategically. And if you've never communicated visually around what that strategy is before, people might not understand what's changed. And so you get ostensible alignment, but it's not really alignment because they don't really understand how things are different than they were before. And so, again, the visuals are a forcing function to really understand the trade-offs. And so it's not always comfortable to make those trade-offs really clear. But that little bit of pain up front, I think, can go a long way towards making sure that what you launch to customers is as thoughtful as possible, really accomplishes the goals that you have, and meets the expectation of the team as well as everyone else in the company.
Okay, so I'm sold on the visuals. For most people listening, I think this is going to be a pretty big departure from how they've been working for their whole product careers. So can you just break down for them very tactically, like how do you, when you're going about doing your product advisory commitments, how do you plan ahead? Like, I have to share a strategy document. How early in advance do you typically get started? How early do you loop in a designer to make sure that you can have those 25 wireframes that are at quality? How do you make this actually, the sausage get made?
So I think really important is to create the time and the space for it, because it does take time to put together this type of document, both in terms of the research as well as just creating the deliverable and then communicating it to everyone. It doesn't need to take months. I think within kind of 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the scale of the strategy you're working on, it's enough to go from, we're starting to think about something to we actually have a really concrete strategy down on paper. So I think the first thing is to get everyone to commit to, we're going to make this a priority. And that means that a meaningful amount of time for myself and other people in the organization is going to be spent on this. And that means that's going to actually affect our quarterly goals. Like, let's actually put it on our quarterly goals that we're developing and delivering this strategy. So it's not something that we kind of assume is a side hustle. It's something that is core to the job. So I think explicitly making time and space for it is really important. And then I think really important is to create the team that is going to be aligned around that strategy from day one. And so that means it's not just the product manager driving it, but also the person from design, from engineering, any other key functional groups within the company. It might be marketing, it might be data analysis, it might be user research. And so that collective group of people needs to be collectively, I think, accountable and responsible for developing the strategy. And then depending on like how much time, the relative skills on the team, how much time people have, you can figure out the right way to get the specific designs done as well as get the other work done. But it's really important, I think, that at the outset, it's a cross-functional effort rather than kind of product going away and coming back and saying, here's our strategy.
I like that. I like the idea of kind of having at least, and I think it's especially important on that design resource, like 2 to 6 weeks of their time that we're going to be focused on building this, because expecting someone to just do wireframes while they're also responsible for delivering features to hit our metrics for the quarter just is a recipe for burnout.
For sure. And then I think it is important to have design involved, but at the same time, you don't need to be dependent on a designer to come in and do fancy wireframes in Figma. Anyone could pick up Balsamic, anyone can pick up Excalidraw, you can do this in FigJam. Wireframes can be really easy at, it's just a set of boxes to carve out the different ways that the features are going to work, the different trade-offs that we're making. And so every artist, before they sketch or before they create a masterpiece, will sketch. And they need that framework. They need that skeleton to be able to make sure that everything that they're laying down on the canvas works well. The wireframes are the sketch. They're not the final painting. And being able to sketch quickly, whether you're a product person, a designer, anyone else on the team, is important. And it's not the domain of just certain people. should invite others to do that as well, right? If the marketing person has an idea for how to really get this across well, there's no reason they can't sketch it up, throw something together, and then you could start talking visually about what that would be.
The future of marketing is word of mouth. Turn your users and partners into your most valuable growth channel with podcast partner Cello. Cello is the only all-in-one solution to engage your most passionate users and partners to refer your product with just a few clicks. Best of all, Cello is directly embedded into your product and handles everything from referral payments to tax and compliance. And it runs on autopilot, so you can focus on scaling and building your own product. Here's how it works. First, within just a few hours, Cello integrates with your product and existing tools to automate all manual work. In your dashboard, you can then set up your referral campaign, define the reward details, and make the referral experience your own. After the program goes live, Cello continuously analyzes and scales its performance based on AI-generated recommendations. Plus, you only pay for successful. Go give it a try for free and learn more about user-led growth at cello.so/product growth. You were a director of product at Facebook. It's got one of the biggest product orgs, even as a director of product at Facebook. What would be kind of the realistic, how often might you be jumping into a product sketch process?
I think what's really interesting about Facebook is the amount of resourcing is so high that product triad is almost always there from day one. There's 5 groups that are really essential to the product development process. There's design, there's data science, there's user research, there's product, and there's engineering. And you will know who are those 5 folks for any initiative. And I think what's really interesting is something that people don't talk enough about is they often ask, what's the ratio between product and engineering? But equally important is what is the ratio between product and design and user research and data science and all these other teams within the company? And then also really important is that ratio not only dictates sort of the amount of work that gets done, but it dictates what work gets done. So when you have very few designers for every single product person, the designers don't have time to proactively design. And so as a result, the proactive design never gets done. And you really have to explicitly call out and say, we're going into a strategy sprint and we're going to shift our focus from reactive, we just got to get stuff done, to more proactive wireframing and more strategic design. One of the nice things about Facebook is the design teams, the user research teams are still so well staffed that my experience was we were always going through that process. There was always some proactive, thoughtful kind of strategic consideration happening in some element of what we were building. And I think that increased the overall quality of what was getting built. And that staffing level was really different than TripAdvisor. TripAdvisor just had a handful of designers for a very large product team and just had a handful of data analysts for a very large product team. And as a result, the strategic work needed to be much more explicit about we're taking time now to do the strategic work and we're dedicating people to do it. Because if you didn't, they would just get pulled into other things. And so, I think it really does depend on the company, and it partly depends on the staffing levels. And if your company is one where you're just not doing enough of that proactive strategic work, it's worth taking a step back and asking the question of, will we be able to set 2 weeks or a few weeks aside here and actually move much faster over the long run than if we were to just kind of be heads down? Because sometimes taking 2 weeks and zooming out can help you move much faster over the next 12 months than just being heads down every single minute of every day.
Got it. So for most environments, even a director of product might be jumping and doing some of this or carving out time for proactive time. But in these ideal, environments like Facebook and Google, what does it look like then? How does your interface into these visual strategy documents that are being created as a director look like?
I think it really comes from the overall annual strategy process. What is the company trying to achieve? And then oftentimes, so at Facebook, there were strategy documents developed for H1 and H2, so at kind of the 6-month level. And then based on that, individual teams would engage with that and then figure out what they wanted to build, guided by that overarching strategy. And some of that was bottoms up. So there wasn't a really clear, strategy is always top down. It was a continually evolving thing. But my experience at Facebook, and I've heard this about Google as well, is there is a really good strategic rhythm around what are the things that we're building and what are the guidelines for a particular period of time. And when you're at a startup, there's not as much of an opportunity to have that strategic rhythm. There's just too much stuff happening on an execution level. And so, oftentimes the right thing is to make sure that you have a strategic rhythm at least on a quarterly basis, where you're doing quarterly goal setting and potentially quarterly reviews of strategy. You don't need to be redefining the strategy every quarter, so that the company is, heads down the majority of the time, but once every 3 months or so is picking their head up. And that frequency with which you look at things strategically versus from an execution standpoint can change depending on the context. Like some startups are moving really, really fast, and a month is an eternity. And so you'll want to kind of evaluate things every month. And in other startups, quarterly or a semi-annual basis is totally fine. And so that rhythm of strategic thinking and goal setting is something that companies should think really thoughtfully based on how many resources do you have, how quickly is your strategic landscape changing, and how often do we want to revisit these decisions.
Got it. And for companies who are maybe like one step behind Facebook and they want to reach that relatively strong rhythm that you mentioned, it sounds like it's on a half year. Can you kind of peel back the layers for that? Like how does Facebook manage a strong process? Because I noticed, for instance, when I went from like group product manager to director of product, that I suddenly felt kind of almost like a competition going into these planning processes. Yeah. Like my strategy is going to be weighed against everybody else's. And so I would want to, marshal as many of my internal resources to work on that together with me ahead of time and things like that. What does it look like at Facebook? How do you make it so that, it is a well-functioning process?
I think it comes down a lot to the layers of leadership and how that ladders into an overarching strategy. So when I was there, it was, Mark would set kind of what he wanted to accomplish for the year, usually articulated both through like a really memorable statement and then a little bit of expansion on what that specifically means. And so for 1 year, it was meaningful interactions. So enabling people to have more meaningful interactions so that, people aren't just interacting on the platform for engagement's sake, but actually are having a meaningful experience that makes them feel better from a wellness standpoint, that is more socially meaningful. And what that means is that's often interactions with close friends rather than with influencers or rather than with content. And so that idea of meaningful interactions is something that cascaded throughout the company, and different teams took it in different ways. And so, for example, the Facebook dating initiative actually came out of the profile team looking at, well, how can we create really meaningful interactions around profiles? Well, what's one of the most meaningful interactions around profiles? It's meeting other people. And so maybe there's a really interesting dating strategy here. The marketplace team would look at that differently. The Facebook video team would look at that differently. And so that process of sort of taking that overarching strategy and then breaking it down into what this means for each individual team was something that each of the executives would do. And then each time they did that, they would be more specific about their particular area, and they would expand on what does that mean for that area and what are the relative priorities. And there'd of course be things that are priorities that are outside of that specific criteria as well. And I think what oftentimes it came down to is individual leaders having a really clear ability to articulate themselves concisely and completely so that everyone had this thing that they could grab onto to understand the context that they were operating in. I think for teams that want to do this better, the problem that we fundamentally have as larger organizations and even smaller organizations in some cases is that the strategy gets implemented through the micro decisions of individual people, like individual code getting written, individual design decisions getting made. And a company that is really strategic aligns all of those micro decisions really well. At a company that is less strategic, people are just making those decisions in a vacuum, and they may or may not ladder up to a strategy. So that kind of like cascading strategy process and having that rhythm at Facebook was a really good way of making, I think, most teams feel like they had the context to do their work well. And I've seen that exists at some companies, that doesn't exist at other companies. It really depends.
Okay. So that was kind of our extra deep dive into building strategy for all of you leaders out there who want to get your strategy to operate better. Now I want to move into turning strategy to action. And we talked about this at the beginning. It's just as important. It's the flip side of the coin. And obviously a lot of our listeners, that you're going to be familiar with your quarterly OKRs. You've actually developed NCTs, which is a slight different way to think about strategy to action. So can you talk about, what the problems with OKRs were and why you developed NCTs to address those?
Yeah, definitely. So this came out of kind of multiple years of working with OKRs and trying to understand how do you get them to work really well for a team. And almost every team that I've talked with has had some challenges with OKRs. And so it's pretty common. So we got to thinking when I was at TripAdvisor, like, what are we trying to accomplish with our goal setting framework and our process? And how do we do that in a way that might work better than OKRs? And I think OKRs suffer from a few different challenges. The first one is that at a very high level, and John Doerr even says this in his TED Talk about goal setting is really a three-legged process. You need the what, you need the why, and you need the how. The fundamental problem with OKRs is it's only got two out of the three legs. So it's got the what is the objective, and the how is the key result. And the why comes down to these really strong strategic processes that companies like Facebook and Google have that we just talked about. And so if you're creating goals outside of that strategic framework, then companies are often looking to the goals to do the heavy lifting around what is the strategy. And the problem is, startups and other companies that are using OKRs don't really solve for that. They don't understand it. And so a lot of times you can look at a set of OKRs for an organization and not be able to tell what is the strategy that the organization is trying to solve for, because you've got the what, you've got the how, you don't have the why. The other thing is, just from a pure language standpoint, objectives and key results, people often confuse the two and don't have a clear enough distinction between the two. And when there's not a clear enough distinction, they put almost all of the emphasis on the key results. And because of the words key result, everyone kind of thinks about key results in terms of metrics alone. And what is the specific metric that we want to move? And so, at the end of a quarterly planning process, you have all these really ambitious OKRs around moving key results, like, increasing revenue or increasing engagement or increasing retention, but not a clear plan for how you're doing that and not a clear plan for why you're doing that. And so narratives, commitments, and tasks aims to solve a few of those common challenges. And I think OKRs can work well. It does require some thinking and some process around how to get it to work well. NCTs, I think, just make it a little bit easier by being more explicit about a few things. So the first piece is the narrative. The narrative is a 1 to 3 sentence story of what you're trying to accomplish strategically. So why is this goal really important for the company? And the reason it is called a narrative is because you are trying to tell a story. It's not 4 or 5 words. It's a few sentences that provide the context. And then a description of why a goal might be important. So for example, for TripAdvisor, for the travel planning team that I talked about earlier, the goal was we noticed that a lot of people were using TripAdvisor intermediated through Google. So they were coming into TripAdvisor multiple times through Google rather than coming domain direct. And we wanted to change that behavior. So that was the context that we were operating in. And all of the goals from trip planning sort of flowed from that. So the narrative is that kind of 1 to 3 sentence story that tells you why. Then the commitment are usually like 2 to 5 very concrete things that the team wants to commit to in order to make progress on their narrative. And the word commitment is used very deliberately for a few reasons. One, it's not necessarily a key result or a metric. Sometimes the best thing that a team can do to move the ball forward is to deliver on some outputs rather than outcomes, right? It might be delivering a strategy document. It might be improving a feature in the experimentation platform. It might just be, if you're trying to grow, it might just be getting 200 pages live for SEO. And so sometimes there are output commitments that are as important as any sort of metrics-based goal, and they're a necessary first step towards meeting those metrics-based goals. And so the word commitment, it's something that you're 100% convinced, or as close to 100% convinced as possible, that you can achieve by the end of the quarter, that is going to move the ball forward on your narrative. And then the tasks are the how. The task is just a scratch pad of individual things that you feel like you need to do in order to achieve your commitments and make progress on your narrative. The task is the most fluid part of the goal setting process. It's really meant to give teams a warm start in the quarter so that they're hitting the first day of the quarter knowing these are the types of things that we can do in order to achieve our commitments. And the idea there is that if by the end of the quarter you've done none of your tasks but achieved all of your commitments, the quarter was really successful. If on the other hand you did all of the tasks but achieved none of your commitments, then the quarter wasn't successful. So the tasks aren't what measure progress, it's really the commitments that measure progress. And so collectively, those three things, the narrative, the commitments, and the tasks, are the three pillars of a really strong goal-setting framework: the what, the why, and the how.
I like how much more of the why is brought into this framework, and that I think is one of its key advantages. Now I'd like to explore some of your hot takes on product management, and there are a lot of them, so I had to choose just a few. But one of the ones that you've dove into in a couple conversations recently is about two types of leadership: scalable autonomy and selective micromanagement. And micromanagement is one of those really hot topics, kind of like designers' wireframing, where I think the majority, probably 90%, are on the side of, pitchforks out. How can you possibly say that? So tell me a little bit more about why more product leaders should be thinking about selective micromanagement.
Yeah, so I think good leaders care about the details, right? We talked about dynamic range. They don't just focus on what's high level. They focus all the way down to the nitty-gritty execution. And we could see that in a lot of leaders in tech. The ones that we talk about day to day often have a reputation as being micromanagers, whether it's Elon Musk or Zuckerberg or others. And that's because they care about the details and they're willing to zoom into those details if they don't feel like those details align with what they're trying to accomplish strategically. And I think that is a good lesson for leaders at all levels in an organization. I love a good framework, and every good framework starts with the 2x2 matrix. And if we think about two axes, one axis is a leader wants to feel a sense of control, right? Either they have control or they don't have control. The other axis is a team wants to feel a sense of autonomy. Either they have autonomy or they don't have autonomy. Scalable leadership is when you deliver on both at the same time. You as a leader feel like you have a sense of control, and the team has a sense of autonomy. And if you can do that, that's the perfect place to be. That's the place that makes the team really happy. It gives the leader not only a sense of control, but also the ability to scale and have that person put their attention wherever they need to. And so that's really the goal. But if we can't achieve both of those at the same time, then we need to make a trade-off. So if the leader is not feeling a sense of control, because things are not necessarily going in the direction that you want, there's two things you can do. You could be sort of hands-off and say, okay, the team will figure it out, or you can decide to selectively micromanage. Jump in with the goal of getting the team back aligned, and then knowing that once the team is aligned, you can zoom back out and try to get to that scalable leadership model. The problem with the hands-off approach, where you just say, the team's autonomy, their sense of autonomy is the most important thing, is that the leader doesn't have a sense of control. The team probably doesn't have a sense of autonomy either, because they don't actually know what the context is. And so I refer to this as like hands-off leadership. And that just sets everyone up to fail, right? That sets the leader up to fail because the leader doesn't necessarily believe in what the team is doing. And it sets the team up to fail because the team doesn't actually know where they should be going, because the leader hasn't articulated that direction and the leader doesn't believe in what they're currently doing. And so the only solution that really works in that case is for the person to jump in, zoom in, micromanage for a period of time selectively, make sure that the team's work is aligned with what the leader thinks is important and will create value for the business, and then zoom out. And so that's where selective micromanagement, I think, is really important. A good leader will vacillate between selective micromanagement and scalable leadership. And in the process of doing that, we'll give teams the context that they need to succeed while also feeling great about the direction of the team and about the company.
Preach. I couldn't agree more. And I hope that that's a theme for everybody listening on this episode. The pixels matter, the execution matters, the quality matters. If there's anything we've learned from Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Ravi Mehta, it's that you have to get into the details.
Absolutely.
All right. So you've mentioned that you think A/B testing is overrated. This is one that I'm a little bit more skeptical on. As a huge fan of A/B testing myself, I definitely made my career on, a series of A/B tests that just really performed, and I could then point to, hey, this was my impact. So I'm curious, what's your evolution in thinking here? Because I believe you've ran thousands of A/B tests as well.
Yeah, and so I don't necessarily think A/B testing is overrated as much as I think it's overused. As sort of the only solution to understanding what's going to work or not work for the customer. So I've run over 1,000 A/B tests, tests that have generated over $100 million in incremental revenue. And I really do believe in A/B testing as a way to understand things, but understand things in very specific circumstances. A/B testing is great when you have a lot of traffic, and where you can split the traffic between a really clear hypothesis. And when you can do that, you can get the sort of concrete scientific input that you just couldn't get anywhere else. The problem that I see is I think a lot of product teams over-rely on A/B testing, and instead of making their own intuitive decisions, they just rely on what the A/B test says. And so often I've seen teams look at an A/B test that was up and say, I don't really understand it, but it's up, so we're just going to launch it. And I think that that's a recipe for disaster. The first reason it's a recipe for disaster is that with a 95% confidence interval, 1 out of every 20 tests that's up is wrong, right? That's just the math. And so 1 out of 20 odds is not great. So you're going to be shipping some things that are wrong to the customer just because of the way that confidence intervals work. And in reality, like, the confidence intervals are usually wider than that because most companies don't have enough data to really narrow those confidence intervals down. So we already know that we're going off something that isn't already right. And then intuitively, if it doesn't work well for the customer, then that's a signal that something is not right. We've all seen products that are the result of A/B testing. They become a Frankenstein. I was just on a blog the other day. I was trying to do some research, and there was literally ads coming in from all over, and I couldn't even click on the link that I needed to click on. I had my cookie permission thing on the bottom. I had a side ad. I had a video ad coming in from the top. And I was really interested in staying on this site and clicking to the next page, and I just couldn't do it. And that is the result of A/B testing substituting for really thoughtful, intuitive, design-driven, customer-driven thinking. And so there are multiple different ways to learn. You can learn empirically through A/B testing, but you can also learn by talking to customers. You can also learn through your own sense, your own intuition, and test out that intuition. And sometimes you can test it out with A/B testing. I've been working with a health tech company that makes a product where people can come directly to the platform and contract with providers to get healthcare in various areas, whether it's skincare, mental health care. And we just launched a weight loss product. And in order to really deliver a great service to the user, we want to onboard them into the program. And that means asking them a lot of questions about themselves. Ask them, what are their weight loss goals? What is their medical history? Whether or not they have any allergies, current height and weight, so we can make some estimates. And the intake experience is 25 screens long. And so we went from a 3-screen intake experience to a 25-screen intake experience, and our conversion rate didn't change at all. And from an A/B testing standpoint, everyone would say, oh, that new experience with a much longer funnel is going to tank your conversion rate. And it didn't, because intuitively, we knew that patients are making a really important high-stake decision for themselves. They need as much information as possible in order for them to feel like they're making a good decision. And the providers need as much information as possible in order to deliver really good care. And the fact that we're asking for that information will actually make customers believe more in the product. And so that's an example of where I think design-driven innovation and experimentation-driven innovation can work together, and you can over-index on one or the others.
Design-driven innovation. I think that seems to be one of the big themes we're hearing about. And I think you tend to believe in that as well, just more broadly in terms of the importance of design. I think you mentioned that one of the sort of the key takeaways of AI doing so well over the past 2 or 3 years is that the role of design is going to become increasingly important. Why do you think that is, and what are kind of the implications for the nervous product managers listening?
Yeah, I think a lot of us can already see this in our work. Like, I'm spending a lot more time in Figma now than I ever have spent in designs in the past. And that's where a lot of the speccing is happening. That's where a lot of the conversations are happening. That's where the copy editing is happening. That's where the handoff to the developers is happening. And I think that is broadly a really good trend for product overall. Ultimately, product is a visual medium. We're putting software in a person's hands, and they're engaging with it on a desktop screen or a mobile screen. Maybe there's other interfaces as well. But most of the time it is through some two-dimensional interface that a person is engaging with the product. And that interface is the customer's doorway to the value that your product creates. And if that doorway is thoughtful and designed really intuitively, then they'll have no problem walking through it and getting value from your product. But if, on the other hand, you don't think about how that doorway is designed until the last piece, and you think about it just as a design problem, not as a product strategy problem, then a person's going to have a much harder time getting value from your product. And so I think that, as we look at what is happening from an AI standpoint, and as it makes developers more efficient, as it will make some of the things around strategy and writing PRDs and things of that sort more efficient, the area where I don't think it's going to meaningfully change things is the taste and the thoughtfulness that it takes to think about the user experience for a product and create one that is as fluid as possible. And so that's where I think designers can serve a really meaningful role and an increasingly meaningful role in the product development process. That doesn't mean I think that marginalizes product folks. There is a really important part of the product role, which is to be the voice of the customer, the advocate for the customer, the person who understands the customer the best in the organization, and to amplify that voice and to make sure that voice carries through the product, and that product really helps both serve the customer and serve the business. That is going to be very critical as well. But design will be critical as well as we think about kind of where AI is taking things over time. And I think for both of those things, both in terms of business strategy and in terms of UX, I think it's going to be a long time before AI can really replace that.
Yeah, those seem to be the things that AI is really bad at. If you ask ChatGPT or Claude to create a wireframe or create a sketch, it has absolutely no taste.
No taste at all. Sometimes it's very and this is true of some of the words that come out of Claude and ChatGPT, it feels a little sterile, a little neutral. And people want products with personality, and people want products that are bespoke rather than generic.
100%. So one of your most memorable pieces of PM content, and I honestly have probably sent this to 50 people in my career, both when I was actually a PM leader and now as a content creator. So this has to be one of the most banging pieces of PM content ever written, is what shape are you as a PM? So can you walk us through kind of the major shapes of PMs, and how do you use this to help PMs grow in their careers?
Yeah, so this came about when I was at TripAdvisor. We were hiring people directly out of college into their first PM role. We were hiring people out of business school. They would, regardless whether or not they had product experience before, into a product rotational program where they would spend 2 years as a PM rotating through 4 different teams in the company, and would graduate out of the program into a full-time PM role. And so one of the questions that we asked ourselves is, how can we take someone that has never had PM experience in the past and help them understand what competencies are really necessary for them to develop into a thoughtful, well-rounded product manager? And so there's sort of 12 different competencies within the framework. It's organized into 4 different areas. The first area is product execution. The second area is customer insight. The third area is product strategy. The fourth area is influencing people. each one of those 4 areas has 3 competencies that go into it. So for example, product execution consists of being able to write functional specifications, being able to work with the team on product delivery, and being able to deliver products that have high quality. So I won't go through all 12 of the competencies right now, but the idea with the framework is that the goal is to help people understand, one, what is the full sort of role of a product manager, and then help people understand how do you stack up against that. Because across those 12 things, there is not a single person that is amazing at all 12 of those things. And some of those things are actually at tension with each other. One of them is around user interface or user experience design. Another one is around fluency with analytics. And so sometimes people that are really analytical are less design oriented. There's traits around being really strategic and then being really execution focused. And so it's hard for any one person to be great at all of these things. And the goal of the tool is to help a person understand themselves. And then as a result of understanding themselves, understand who are the complementary people that they can work with in the product organization and the rest of the product development organization in order to form a really complete team. And the underlying idea behind the competencies is that stellar people tend to be spiky in a few areas. And so individuals are spiky, but teams are well-rounded. And so the competencies give you a tool to be able to understand how you kind of stack across each of these different things. What are some areas where, you're really uniquely great? What are some areas where you want to invest some more? And what are some areas where you want to work with complementary people? And the goal of this was to have a single tool that a person can use when they start as an APM all the way up to a CPO, and have those competencies sort of stay the same throughout that journey so they can understand how they're evolving over time.
I think of it as basically putting like a very useful framework on self-awareness. Is that a fair way to think about it?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. And as with any framework, it's really meant to stimulate thinking rather than be the entire answer. And just having a person sort of think about their skills through the lens of those 12 things can help a person understand a little bit better why some things feel really good to them and other things feel really challenging, why they're kind of showing up, in front of the team in a really great way in some ways, and why they're getting potentially critical feedback in other ways. So yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it.
And you transitioned really well into my next question, which is we've covered like 3 major frameworks for folks. They might be getting kind of framework eye glazes at this point: product strategy stack, NCTs, shape of PM. You've mentioned that frameworks are never deliverables themselves, but means to better thinking. How do you ensure that frameworks enhance rather than constrain product thinking?
Yeah, I think Brian Balfour has this really good saying, which is frameworks are a tool, not a rule. And so the idea here is that you can make your thinking a lot clearer if you start to categorize that thinking. And so I think every single framework starts with just a distinction. What is the fundamental distinction here that we want to think about, right? And so for the product competencies, the distinction was, some elements of the product job is around execution, some elements is around strategy. Okay, now let's start to think about, for those 2 different spheres, what does that look like, and what traits are part of one and what traits are part of another. And so oftentimes, if you can, as you're thinking through a problem, create a distinction and then start to sort ideas into one bucket or another, things will become much sharper. And then you could do that again. So a 2x2 matrix is just 2 distinctions that you put together. So earlier we talked about leaders want a sense of control, teams want a sense of autonomy. That's 2 different distinctions. Does the team feel a sense of autonomy? Do they not feel a sense of autonomy? Does the leader feel a sense of control, or do they not feel a sense of control? And now that you have 2 different distinctions, you can look at those together, and you've now got 4 different quadrants. And sometimes those 4 quadrants can be really meaningful. I think another great 2x2 framework is radical candor, where you want to care about people personally and you want to challenge them directly. And if you could do both of those at the same time, you have radical candor. But if you're caring about someone personally, but you're not challenging them, that's ruinous empathy. And so oftentimes just being able to have 1 or 2 distinctions can really clarify the thinking. I think you ask a really good question, which is how do you make sure that it's constraining or that it's clarifying and not constraining. And that's where I think this idea that they're a tool and not a rule is really important. If that framework isn't working, throw it out, and maybe there's a different way of looking at the problem that feels a lot clearer. And oftentimes, what I encourage people to do if they're looking at using a framework that I've shared is to think about it through the lens of, does this make sense for you? Does this make sense for your organization? And if it does, great, use it off the shelf. If it doesn't, maybe you change something. So for the strategy stack, maybe you feel really strongly that goals have to inform your roadmap. So you just flip the bottom two of those, and then you've customized the framework for you. And rather than feeling like you're failing at using the framework, you now have something really bespoke for you that matches your expectation of how things work and how you think about things, and can be something that helps you think more clearly and then helps the team understand better as well.
I agree. I always found frameworks are a great starting point. They're a great thing to react to. When you sit down to build a product strategy, you don't want to stare at a blank page. It's much better to pull up the product strategy stack, pull up Ravi's artifact, and say, gosh, in my context and situation, maybe I can't use 25 wireframes, but I probably do need 10 wireframes, and I probably do need them to address this and this. And so that's how I think people should use this. Any content creator out there, especially one who's been in the game as long as Ravi, is going to be developing frameworks, but these are just useful shortcuts to kind of summarize all his thinking. Focus more on why he put that in there than what he actually has.
And a lot of people ask me, and they'll say, oh, can you share with me an example of a time when you used the strategy stack? And strategy, I found, is so specific from company to company. I don't have great examples because I rarely use it exactly as it is. I'll usually use it as sort of a first pass, and then I'll customize it for the company that I'm working with. And I encourage people to do that same sort of thing. Use it as a starting point, not an ending point.
All right. So you've held many roles, many titles that many people dream of having, especially, those VP and director titles at these big companies. What is the career advice for people who want those roles and titles that you find yourself often repeating?
I think the biggest one is to be a thought leader, but not a thought leader in the sense that you've got to start a newsletter, you got to build an audience, and this is now something that you're going to spend 10 hours a week on. But be a thought leader in the sense of, you have things that you know uniquely well and uniquely deeply, and people can't tell that from your resume. They can't really, in most cases, they can't tell it from your LinkedIn page. If you just take a moment to write some of that stuff down, you can share it in LinkedIn articles, you can set up a blog, so that there is a wider slice of you on the internet that people can access and learn from. That's going to instantly set you apart from everyone else who's looking for a similar role. Because oftentimes, and I do this when I'm hiring folks, one of the first things I'll do is I'll just go to a person's LinkedIn, and then I'll click on the links that they link to, because I want to try to get to know the person better. Resumes are so formulaic that they're really hard to get a 360-degree view of someone. And if there's nothing for that person to see, that's really a missed opportunity. If instead, someone can go to an interesting article or an interesting post where you've shared something that might even be relevant to the role that you've applied for, all of a sudden you've got a leg up, and that person feels like they know you a little bit better. So I think that's the most important thing that people can do, especially for product folks. Developers have this naturally with their GitHub. Designers have this naturally with their portfolio. Even in those cases, it's surprising how many engineers have very little on their GitHub and how many designers don't put a lot of thinking into their portfolio. But think about the equivalent for yourself. What is your portfolio of your work that you want accessible out there, so that when you are looking for a role, people are seeing that and making that decision about you in a much wider context of what you're capable of.
Plus 100. So Ravi spends his time advising product teams. These days, I'm advising a lot of job seekers, and this advice works, guys. And the interesting thing is, when Ravi got those jobs, I feel like he may not have always needed to do that 3 or 4 years ago, but now the market is a bloodbath. There's so much high quality talent out there that if you think about the supply being so high with so much talent, but also the demand probably being a little bit constrained these days, you want to go the extra mile with those types of tactics. So thank you so much for actually advocating for that when product content gets so much hate these days.
Absolutely. I think the other thing that could be really helpful is connect with folks that are connectors, right? A lot of VCs know tons of startups that are hiring. There's often, people who are running incubators know tons of people in the local community. There might be a handful of people that are really like active in your local area around tech. And so the combination of like being a thought leader and then connecting with connectors is a great way to accelerate both the outreach that you have, so the overall exposure that you have, as well as the amount of that outreach that you can convert into interest in you as a candidate.
Love it. So that kind of ends it for our core product talk. Are you ready to move on to the lightning round?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Let's do it. What's your favorite hobby?
My favorite hobby is photography. It's something I've loved throughout my life. I've kind of moved away from it as I've gotten older, but I'm starting to do it more on my phone. And it's just, a nice opportunity to kind of step back, see the world, focus on that and nothing else. And I really enjoy it.
I love the new aperture settings on the iPhone. Have you checked those out?
Yeah, I will do most things in black and white now, and I do everything in the camera app. It's gotten really powerful.
What's your favorite interview question of PM candidates?
So I ask candidates, tell me about a product that you love. Why do you love it? And if you could change something about it, what would you change? And I can talk to a candidate for 60 minutes on that question. And I found it's a really good way to sort of baseline, understand how a person thinks about product. And you can go through all of the different areas. You can talk to them about how they would measure the success of the feature that they're thinking about. You can get a sense of their product strategy skills. You can ask them specific UX questions. You can ask them how they use the product to see if they can think about things from a user research perspective, if they've talked to other people that have used the product. So I found it's a really good way just to get a 360-degree view of a candidate.
Used to be one of my favorites too. What is your favorite product or growth book?
I think my favorite one is still Hooked by Nir Eyal. I feel like, it just got this beautifully simple and effective framework for how to think about how to create engaging products. I think there's been some, as we've thought more about, should products be engaging in that way or even potentially addicting. I think there's been some, I wouldn't say backlash, but I think there's been some, sort of counter perspectives on that. At the same time, the idea of if you're creating something valuable for users and that they enjoy and that's adding utility to their life, it's really important to think about how to help them create a habit around that and how to help them continue to get that value. And that's the most straightforward way that I've seen that you can do that.
Nice. Yeah. I collaborated with Nir earlier this year, and I think he's the most science-driven product content creator. Like, if there isn't like 10 studies behind it, he's not talking about it. So I love that about Hooked.
And it's so concise and well-researched. You get these really, I think, powerful insights every page of the book.
What's a newsletter you love reading?
I really like One Useful Thing by Ethan Mollick. He's a Wharton professor. He's writing a lot about AI. He's kind of writing as he learns about AI. He's already an expert on AI. I think he knows more about the different platforms than even sometimes the creators of those platforms themselves. But you feel like with each one of these newsletters that you're on this journey with him and that he's discovering things in real time. And so I look forward to that every week.
Wow. Only 4 episodes in, and that newsletter has been recommended twice. I've also taken 2 classes from Ethan when I was at Wharton. The man is prolific and a workaholic. Wow. And he's really broken into the product audience.
He has been for a long time too.
Yeah, good for him. What's a new product you've started using and enjoy?
I really love Excalidraw. So it's a tool, it's a diagramming tool. It's used by a lot of engineers to do technical diagrams, but I found it's really helpful to do really quick kind of block level wireframes. And it's a really interesting example of a tool that has a lot of micro innovations built in. So really easy to learn the hotkeys for the different shapes and text. It's pretty constrained. The lines are kind of rough like balsamic, so it doesn't have you getting too precious about your designs. You don't need an account. It'll save your diagram in your local storage in your browser, and you can upgrade and get an account with cloud storage if you want, but you can just start right away. I think it's a really interesting product, both because I love using it and it helps me sketch out ideas really quickly, but it's also a really good example of how when you take a very customer driven and a very detail-oriented approach, like we've been talking about this entire conversation, you can create something that feels really similar. There's lots of diagramming tools that are out there, but the accumulation of the different innovations make it so it's just much faster. It's more delightful than any tool that I've used before.
Nice. Yeah, no hate to the Balsamiq product team, but I can't for the life of me figure out what's changed in that product in the last 15 years. So Excalibur, I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, check it out. Not a lot has changed in Balsamiq, but I kind of like that because I'm pretty proficient with it. So that might be a feature rather than a bug. But I've started using Excalibur more because it's a little bit more flexible.
Very cool. What product feature or product are you most proud of shipping?
I think I'm most proud of shipping. So I was at TripAdvisor for a number of years. During that time, we did some really fundamental things with the site. At the time that I started, you couldn't get hotel prices on the site. You couldn't book hotels on the site. You'd actually have to go out to Expedia or Booking.com to get just even look up the price of a room. Attractions weren't bookable on the site. Restaurants weren't bookable on the site. And over the course of the time that I was there, we moved from being very review-oriented, being very media-oriented, to being much more of a transactional platform. And I shifted a number of features related to that, including the ability to get hotel prices directly on TripAdvisor, the ability to instant book attractions, restaurants, hotels on TripAdvisor, and a whole bunch of really interesting personalization and search and discovery work around that. So, that's a set of products I'm really proud of.
That's awesome. Yeah. So the TripAdvisor, maybe younger people didn't used to always be that way. It used to be a review giant, but it sounds like you really helped transform all of its monetization and build all of those foundational layers. So that's super cool.
Yeah, it became much more transactional in the time that I was there.
What's been one particularly memorable product failure that you learned from?
I'll use a TripAdvisor example as well. We had a feature. It was a personalization feature called Just For You. And the idea was that we could use the accumulation of all of a person's behavioral signals to show them a list of hotels that would just be a much better fit for their preferences. And we had done some testing of that new algorithm and found that it did actually increase click-through rates and increase conversion rates for the hotels that we showed them relative to the default list. But then we rolled that feature out, not sort of as a blind test, but as a feature called Just For You. So we wanted to really brand the personalization aspect of it. And there was a huge backlash to it. Very few people used it. People said that the results weren't very good and that they preferred the default list. And the key learning there was when we just showed people something different algorithmically, we could optimize the algorithm and the user wouldn't know, and you could deliver them better results. But when you claimed that something was just for them, you then needed to not only earn their click, you also had to earn their trust. And the fact that we were saying it was just for them got people questioning, well, how do you know it's just for me? How do I know these are the right hotels? I haven't told you anything about myself or my trip, even though we had a lot of data from their usage of TripAdvisor. So it was a really interesting example of where the functionality that you deliver and then how you surface that functionality to a user are both really important and both factors in whether or not something is going to succeed. So we ended up, taking down Just For You, and then we added a bunch of other personalization work on top of that. It was an interesting example of, a tough a lesson learned the hard way because we were so excited about the launch, but it was pretty clear what the results were.
That really resonates for me. I've done many of such similar tests with personalization. So we've talked about all sorts of product sayings that are, widely accepted that you disagree with. I'm curious if there's just a general sort of commonly held belief or saying, like an aphorism that you disagree with.
I really disagree with outcomes over outputs. I think it's sort of the worst kind of good advice. It is in general good advice, but when it's not good advice, it's really bad advice. And what I think tends to happen is that teams sort of embed this idea that outcomes are better than outputs, and the only way that they set goals for themselves is through outcomes. And, it might be increasing retention by X% or decreasing churn rate or something like that. And the problem is that not all teams have the information that they need to commit to that goal. And the right way to set a goal is really based on this kind of, I call it the frontier of understanding. There's a set of things that are really risky. There's a set of things that you're really confident in. And you could think about that as sort of a spectrum. And there's a point at where the things that you are confident in start to become more risky. And so if you set a goal that's too far in the confidence zone, that's sandbagging, right? Nobody wants to sandbag their goals and commit to something that they know that it can achieve. But if you set a goal too far into the risk zone, it ceases to be useful as a goal because everyone knows you're not going to be able to hit it. And when you don't hit it, the learnings aren't really clear. And so the ideal place to set a goal is at this kind of frontier of understanding where what you know is starting to transition into what you don't know. And sometimes your frontier of understanding is in that metric zone. And so you ask the question of, can we increase retention by 10%? Well, if you have a set of hypotheses that are well-founded and you know what you need to do to test those hypotheses, or you know what levers you need to pull, yeah, maybe you can move retention by 10%. But if you have no idea what the levers are that drive retention, there's no way you can move that metric until you do a little bit more discovery work. And so that discovery work might be a set of things that are more output-oriented than outcome-oriented. And so I think it's really important when teams set goals for themselves is to ask themselves, what we know, what we don't know, and set a goal that is aggressive but achievable. Sometimes that's going to be an outcome. Sometimes that's going to be an output.
I agree. The pendulum has swung a little too far. Probably like 10 years ago, we were too outputs oriented. Now we kind of came way too outcome oriented as a reaction. That was a wonderful discussion on so many different product topics. If people want to learn more, where can people find you online?
Yeah, you could just go to ravimehta.com, and I've got my newsletter there. I also started a Substack. I haven't written much recently, but there's a couple articles there, and there's more to come later this year.
All right. And how can listeners help you?
Yeah, take a look at what I put out there. If there's ideas or things that you would like to see covered or input for how to improve the frameworks, reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn, and I try to respond to my DMs. I'm also accessible on email, so would love to connect with folks.
All right. Thanks so much for being here, Ravi.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find out about the podcast. You can find all the past episodes or learn more about the show at product-growth.com. See you in the next episode.